Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to accompany you today. I know you're watching this video to relax or help you sleep. So first, please like and subscribe. Where are you from? What time is it? Relax, unwind, and enjoy the moment. I died for 6 minutes in 2003. Heaven isn't what we think it is. With apologies to the religious, I feel my story must be shared. In 2003, when I was 15 years old, my heart stopped for 6 minutes. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, at the point in my daily routine when I walked home from the bus stop. In the 4 blocks between the corner where I hopped off the bus and my front door, I started to feel nauseous. It came on suddenly, without warning. I'd felt just fine all day. Ate a lunch of Bosco sticks and marinara sauce, something I'd eaten hundreds of times throughout high school. Before I had an opportunity to consider alternative causes, I broke out in a cold sweat. Then I felt the curious flutter in my chest. My heart slipped into what I later learned was an episode of ventricular fibrillation. I became breathless and collapsed. What happened next has been told to me after the fact. I apparently sprawled in the road, where a woman driving a hatchback nearly crushed my skull beneath her tires. Instead, she screeched to a halt, tried to rouse me, then dialed emergency services when she failed to do so. EMS arrived to discover my heart had stopped beating. I was dead, technically. They transported my body to the hospital, and somewhere along the way managed to shock my ticker back to life. Thus began a harrowing weeks-long journey through the American healthcare system that led eventually to an ablation, pacemaker, and mountains of debt my family's still dealing with. But my heart's all right, and thank fuck it is, because what I learned that day has taught me never to thank God for anything. Because for those 6 minutes, as my lifeless body traveled across the city accompanied by 2 paramedics working tirelessly to revive me, my soul transcended our world to visit the hereafter. During my visit, I learned things about our universe that I wish I hadn't. Perhaps in sharing my story, I might help our species prepare for what comes after we expire. It began with light. Blinding, white, pervasive. It bathed me, calmed me. It was everything they tell you about. Beatific, welcoming, the stuff of spiritual experiences. I had the distinct feeling of ascent, like the light was lifting me skyward. I passed through several sets of gates, which my dizzied consciousness hardly registered. Upon reflection, I don't believe they were physical in any sense, and yet I recall the feeling of admittance, as if they might have prevented me from rising had they remained closed. In any event, I arrived in a place without dimension, a place beyond reality. It only made sense while I occupied it. I don't believe a corporeal being can make sense of the astral plane. Something about its intangible existence defies translation. So, what I came away with were more impressions than images. I was not alone. Several life forces enclosed me upon my arrival. At first, because of my Christian upbringing, I believed them to be angels. In my incorporeal form, I made the spiritually equivalent gesture of opening my arms, anticipating their embrace. Instead, I felt myself shackled by their powers, like a collared dog. Humiliation and terror came over me. These were not the ethereal beings I'd been led to believe await us. These were cruel, unsympathetic overlords by whom I was fettered. Why, I thought, my soul wailing like a petulant child. Something like laughter returned, but it was cold, mocking. Thoughts floated into my consciousness like birds winging in and out of sight. They delivered some horrifying truths about existence that I'll do my best to relay to you now. Our universe, like many others running parallel to it, contains a pittance of the total energy in existence. It is a farm, used to produce souls, which only arise in the precise conditions found in our cosmos. When you hear scientists talk about the improbability of the existence of our Goldilocks universe, it's because they don't actually come into being spontaneously. They're designed. And the hands that craft them are not benevolent gods, but rapacious beings with little care for the creatures they create. Our ultimate purpose, I learned in the custody of the spirits that shackled me, was to ripen until we were ready to serve them on their higher plane. The Big Bang gave birth to the universe to give rise to life, to eventuate in humanity. A sufficiently conscious organism that may be harvested for use as slaves on a higher plane, where time and space dissolve into an eternity we spend in servitude. 6 minutes in heaven felt like a lifetime, which I spent amusing what I perceived to be a childlike spirit with a penchant for psychologically distressing manipulation. It batted me around like a cat with a caught mouse, reveling in the pain it produced. Physical discomforts we imagine hell inflicting upon us pale in comparison to the torture of soul pain. Loss of a loved one comes closest, that piercing emotional damage resulting from trauma. When it became clear my time had not yet expired on Earth and I was to return, I was told not to reveal their existence to the rest of my kind. My reward, they communicated to me, would be a marginally improved station among the slave population. Alternatively, if I managed to convince others of their existence, new horrors would await me when I returned. I can't imagine anything worse than what I experienced, subsumed beneath an ineffable grief and torment. For weeks, I tried to explain to anyone who would listen what I experienced. Everyone told me I'd suffered a very serious and traumatic experience for a young man, that the event left scars on my psyche as well as my heart. I gave up trying to convince them. I slowly began to convince myself that what they'd told me was true. I'd simply imagined it, a death dream as it were, the mind reckoning with its own imminent demise, trying to make sense of the experience. Then I met someone who claimed to have met God. This was a few years later when the author of a non-fiction book recounting their near-death experience visited my hometown. I won't reveal the author's name as I don't want to invite a lawsuit, which I'm sure he'd launch against me if he read that I'd besmirched him. I attended a reading and afterward confronted him about his tale. I looked him in the eye and asked if he really met God, something I'm sure he's dealt with hundreds of times. He smiled and nodded, assuring me that, yes, God is real and is filled with love. On a lark, I decided to tell him that I knew the truth, that slavery awaits us all. A flicker in his gaze betrayed his knowledge of the fact. He really had died and visited the afterlife, but lied about it in his book. Because he knew. He knew the truth of heaven, the horrible place our souls are bound for. An IB horror story. Hi Reddit. This is a post I never thought I'd make. 2 years ago, when I graduated from that godforsaken place, I decided to put all of it behind me. My stress and anxiety and depression, all those unfortunate events that to this day plague my dreams and, regrettably I must admit, my friends as well. I'd always intended to keep in touch with the friends I made at my high school. But that last year, well, it changed us. Really, that's the easiest way to put it. Have you heard of the International Baccalaureate? It's been around for a while, but when I first enrolled in the IB program at my high school, I knew fuck all about it. Let me give you a simple rundown. It's a diploma program designed for students in their last 2 years of high school, on par with the Cambridge A-levels, or the junior and senior years of high school in the US. In the IB, you take 3 subjects at a higher level, similar to AP subjects with transferable credits, and another 3 at standard level. In each subject, you attempt coursework and exams that eventually give you a point from a scale of 1 to 7. So, that's a maximum of 42 points you can get from your subjects alone. Then you've got 2 more components. Teo-Ki, a philosophy-like subject, and a 4,000-word extended essay, a professional research paper that you write on a subject of your choice. Obtaining an A grade in both components gives you an additional 3 points. An A and a B gives you 3 points too. 2 Bs give you 2 points, and 2 Cs give you 1 point. The maximum points you can get in the IB program is 45. 45. I'm not usually a melodramatic person, but that number truly means something else to me after those 2 years in hell. But let's go back a bit. When I first embarked on my IB journey, I was an excited, fresh-faced student. I had just finished secondary school, and, on my teacher's recommendations, I'd applied for a scholarship at this particularly prestigious Chinese boarding school in a small Asian country that I will not name. Just to clear things up, I myself am Asian. After a ridiculously rigorous admissions process that combined 3 interviews with written entrance tests in all 3 sciences and advanced math, I was granted a full scholarship that included both tuition and boarding. To my lower middle class parents, it was a dream come true, and I was ecstatic, of course. I was only 16, and I was going to get to live away from my parents in this new country, this new place, surrounded by people who thought like me, people who believed in hard work and commitment just as much as I did. I don't remember feeling the slightest inkling of sadness when I left my parents behind at the airport and got on a plane to my new life. I feel a curious sort of pity for the person I once was. I'd thought that I was ready. Boy, was I wrong. To be fair, the first few months went by with little to no hassles. That's the thing about stress. It creeps up on you slowly, and I was even more at a disadvantage in that I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. As excited as I had been, I didn't do my homework. I'd neglected to read up on the many demands of the IB program, and I'd neglected to assess my ability to meet them. Maybe if I'd had that kind of foresight, I wouldn't be ridden with nightmares that still haunt me 2 years later. Halfway through my first year at the boarding school, I woke up one morning to find myself drastically behind on coursework, the demands of which I didn't even fully understand. Despite having studied all 3 sciences in secondary school, I still am, a humanities-inclined person. But the conditions of my scholarship required me to take 2 sciences at higher level, instead of the humanities I so wanted to study. I'd initially thought that wouldn't be a problem, until I found out that I'd have to design and carry out an experiment for each of my sciences, and write a research paper based on those experiments. On top of it all, being a scholar, I was expected to get a 7 in each of my subjects, an A in both Itak and my extended essay. I was expected to get a perfect 45 out of 45. It probably doesn't sound that daunting until you remember that I was 16, and at any given point in time, more likely to pen down a poem than look up scholarly articles and learn how the Harvard referencing system works. I'm afraid I haven't even gotten to the true horrors of my story. But in order to understand the level of stress that my friends and I were at, it's important to understand the many things that were expected of us. My friends, the people that I ate every meal with, shared almost every class with, the people I studied with and stood by and eventually cut off all contact with, they consisted of my roommate and about 7 boys. We were a tight group, the 9 of us. Did everything together. We had all come from different countries, and they taught me a lot of things, life lessons that to this day I carry with me. You've got to understand that in my time spent in that hellish place, this band of people were what kept me sane. We looked out for each other, made sure the stress didn't get to us, made sure none of us got too close to the edge. There were many people who tipped over, was the thing. My teachers were relentless, and believed that setting ridiculous and highly unrealistic deadlines for coursework submissions was the most effective way to motivate us. Those of us who could handle it, handled it. Those of us who couldn't, cracked. In the 4th month of our first year, we had our first attempt at suicide. It was a Chinese girl from my cluster who'd fallen back on one too many deadlines, enough to earn her a meeting with the principal and a tentative suspension. She overdosed on sleeping pills and left a note beside her bed. Her roommate found her, rushed her to the hospital, and got her stomach pumped just in time. That was just the first of many. We had 3 more attempted suicides in that first year, and once each of them got out of the hospital, they were punished for their attempts. Detention, caning, exile from the student hub, where we had our sports hall and music rooms. They cracked down on those of us who tried to escape. I remember this one day in November, I was sat on the floor outside my room and on the phone with my mom, and I just broke down. There was a distinct feeling of hopelessness inside me that I can still remember if I shut my eyes and concentrate hard enough. My excitement and hope had been replaced with fear, sadness, and a clear knowledge that there was no way but through it. But I've got to tell you, I almost didn't make it through. I almost didn't make it through. All of us were stressed, some of us were depressed, but Rui Yi, she was okay. Rui Yi was a Filipino-Chinese scholar who I didn't really associate with. She was intense isn't really the word. She was a jovial kid, friendly enough, There was something crazy in her eyes, maybe, but honestly, there was something crazy in all of us. It just stood out in her more, I guess. She didn't have any friends that I can recall. The thing about her was that she was competitive. We were all encouraged to be competitive, but she always took it one step ahead. We were in the same form class, although we didn't share any classes besides, and she'd always stand second. I'd always stand first. After our first term, when our class rankings were revealed, I remember the way she congratulated me, with a firm handshake, a half smirk, that crazy glint in her eyes seemingly magnified. There was something in her demeanor, something that screamed, "I'm coming for you," even if she wouldn't say it out loud. Or maybe I'm just projecting. Maybe I'm only saying this because I know what I know now. The terrible, terrible things that... Well, the first attempted suicide happened the next month. And to be honest, I had more things to worry about than an overly competitive peer. Rui Yi was a female boarder as well, so she lived on my floor, and I happened to run into her often on my way to and from the water dispensers. I can still remember that sight, her in her pajamas, carrying a steaming mug of something away from the water dispenser as I walked in the opposite direction. She'd half smirk at me, and I'd smile back. We'd maybe exchange a hi or a hello, but rarely anything more. I learned from my roommate, who made it her mission to learn everything she could about every girl on the floor, that Rui Yi indulged in traditional medicine. A more accurate term would be that she was obsessed with yin. For the first quarter of the year, she was making herbal chicken in an electric cooker, and drinking herbal tea every morning that left a stale smell in the common rooms. Then she switched to several neem concoctions, creams that she would apply on her face and back, leaves that she would crush and make into tea with honey and ginger. I can't remember what else she dabbled in, all those old wives' tales that were supposed to enhance your memory. Do good things to your brain. She'd carry her mugs and plates around us with an air of superiority, and my roommate amused herself by dropping a choice number of curses behind her back. I remember distinctly this one week, when she cooked a whole baby pig and ate the entire thing. It's something that the Chinese pride themselves on, being able to prepare and consume every part of the pig. On Wednesday, I came out of my room to find her sitting on the sofa and eating a bowl of pig's brain, apparently uncooked. The traditions in themselves were intriguing, but I stayed away from Rui Yi, and Lord, am I glad I did. In that first year, the stress manifested itself in the most obvious way possible, the attempted suicides. The second year wasn't so black and white. As seniors, the expectations from us had risen. Final submissions for different research papers were due every month, and even our weekends didn't feel like weekends. I remember a week where I slept maybe 6 hours in total. I was so busy. Some of my friends didn't even take that time off to sleep. It was a bad time for all of us. People began to disappear around then. It sounds more sinister than it was, but maybe not sinister enough in hindsight. First, it was a girl who lived in the room at the other end of the floor, Rui Yi's roommate. She went home to China during the March holidays and didn't come back. After she was absent from classes for longer than a week, rumors began to sprout. The most prevailing one being that she finally cracked and convinced her parents to withdraw her from that hellish school. Then we stopped thinking of her with worry and switched over to envy. She was a bright kid. She'd flourish elsewhere. Then it was a boy, a roommate of one of my friends. He was clever too, and we remembered him with envy. By the time the third person disappeared in the middle of June, at the crux of our mid-year exams, we began to grow suspicious. My guy friends warned me to be careful, not to go out in the evenings on my own, or to eat anything that the girls on my floor gave me. It sounds ridiculous now, but the atmosphere was getting more and more competitive, and my teachers refused to acknowledge or discuss these disappearances, almost like they weren't happening at all. It was a confusing, scary time. I remember considering, on more than one occasion, withdrawing from the school myself. But my scholarship was airtight. Had I chosen to withdraw, my parents would have to pay the full sum of tuition and boarding that had been previously waived, and we just weren't made of that kind of money. So I stayed. When Mr. Sim was fired, we began to worry for real. Mr. Sim was one of the only mentors in the boarding school who actually seemed human. He was the unofficial 10th member of my group of friends. He looked out for the 9 of us, worried with us when our peers attempted to kill ourselves, and begged us not to ever think of doing the same. He'd do grocery runs for us during exam season, would help us organize notes when we were too worn out. We would have survived without him, sure, but what a struggle it would have been. He left without telling any of us. When we asked the other mentors, we were told not to poke our nose in business that wasn't ours. One of the boys who had his number called him up, and he told us with his own damn voice not to try and contact him again. He sounded shaken, my friend reported. We didn't attempt to talk to him again, and it felt a bit like one of us had attempted suicide and succeeded this time. As you can probably tell, those were bleak times. 5 girls from my cluster, by then, were missing. All the smart ones gone, and 3 boys, if I remember correctly. The only good thing that came out of that period was that Rui Yi stopped making her stinky herbal teas, and the common rooms were once again suitable to study in. Then came our final deadline and research paper submissions, and then our finals, and then graduation, and then home. Home at last. I expected to feel relief after I left that school for good, but all I felt was emptiness. I was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety a week before Christmas, and that sent my parents into a frenzy, claiming that they didn't know it had been that bad for me. I withdrew into myself, stopped talking as much as I used to, spent most of my time in my room. IB had beaten the fight out of me. When my friends texted me, I didn't respond. The memories associated with them had become painful and distorted. I was convinced I would never be the same again. The 2 years that followed passed much in the same way. I'm at university now, and I live in the same town as my parents, although in a flat of my own. I don't have a roommate. I work part-time in the kitchen of a bakery, and I throw myself into uni work. Sometimes I can go days without talking to anyone, except for yesterday. Yesterday, Mr. Sim sent me a friend request on Facebook. Yesterday, I convinced him to allow me to call him on Skype. Yesterday, he told me the truth. Mr. Sim had been one of the welfare mentors in the boarding. The welfare mentors were responsible for visiting our floors regularly, to check on hygiene and make sure that everything, generally, was all right. That last year, the mentor assigned to our floor was newly appointed and apparently unclear on her tasks. They found out well into our last year at the school that she hadn't been making her rounds of our floors at all. She was reprimanded, and Mr. Sim was assigned to check out our floor instead. I remember that day. I remember coming out to get water from the dispenser and finding him on our floor, waving at him and asking him what he was doing there. He'd said he was just checking up on us. I found it odd, maybe, or maybe I didn't find it odd at all. My perception of strangeness and normality had become warped by then. It's completely possible I didn't question it at all, but the smell. How did I not question the smell? It had begun to smell bad around the water dispenser so long ago. It crept up on me, like the stress. So I didn't notice it until Mr. Sim took in a lungful of air and asked me with a pained expression if it always smelt like that on this end of the floor. I'd shrugged, maybe blamed it on the dampness that came with the recent rains. I'd filled up my mug with hot water and went back to my room on the other end. Mr. Sim had one more room to check, Rui Yi's room. He knocked once and didn't get a response. He twisted the knob, opened the door carefully, identifying himself and asking if he could enter. She wasn't in the room. The room was empty. Well, it wasn't empty. He told me yesterday that the first thing that hit him was the smell. It smelt, he told me, like decay, like death. He'd groped blindly for the light switch, turned it on. For a full minute, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. Later, after he'd thrown up 3 times and was shaking so badly he could barely stand, his terrified brain told him he was looking at 8 bodies. 8 dead bodies, with the skulls cracked open and the brains pulled out. There was blood everywhere. There was blood everywhere. He repeated it over and over again yesterday, his voice shaking. I nodded, numbly. I believed him. It was fucked up, and nothing like I could ever have imagined, but I believed him. Those 8 students hadn't disappeared. Rui Yi had killed them, and she'd eaten their brains. She ran out of traditional medicine to try, and pig's brains weren't working for her, so she tried human ones. Mr. Sim says he doesn't remember exactly what he did after that. He remembers locking the door behind him and going immediately to the principal. He remembers being fired on the spot and being so shocked and appalled that he left at once without a word to any of us. I don't know what any of it means, if our principal and our teachers and the rest of the mentors were aware, or if they didn't want to stop her purely out of curiosity. Maybe they just wanted her to get that 45 and were willing to tolerate any means that would help her reach that end. I don't know how much they paid Mr. Sim, but it must have been a lot to convince him not to reach out to any of us until 2 years later. They must have paid the parents of those poor children even more. But I can't even begin to comprehend any of this, which is why I'm typing it out and posting it here. Maybe if I try hard enough, I can pretend that none of this happened, that it's just a story I'm narrating for karma. I haven't tried to contact any of my friends yet. Maybe I will after I post this. Mr. Sim has already said he doesn't want to relive his story again, although he wouldn't mind me telling my friends if I wanted to. But do I really want to? Do I want to relive that horrible year that has somehow become even more horrific 2 years later? One last thing. I suppose you would be curious about this, so I might as well add it in. For what it's worth, I ended up getting a 44 in IB. Rui Yi got her 45. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. Relax, unwind, and get some sleep. See you in the next video.